I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. Life with Sarah was everything I could have imagined in a marriage. We had built a home together, our 2 kids were our pride and joy, and though things had become predictable over the years, I cherished the stability. I didn't need grand gestures or wild spontaneity, my sense of happiness had always been rooted in the everyday moments. I'd come home after a long day at work to the sound of the kids' laughter and Sarah humming while she made dinner. Some men might find that mundane, but to me, it was perfection. The changes in Sarah started subtly. One night, as I cleaned up after dinner, she announced that she would be coming home late the next day. Project deadlines, she explained, dismissing it with a wave. It didn't seem out of the ordinary. She worked in advertising, a job that sometimes demanded extra hours or even late nights. Over the years, I'd grown used to her occasionally throwing herself into these projects, pouring all her energy and attention into whatever her team needed from her. I was proud of her commitment, her drive. So, I didn't think much of it. But then, the late nights began to multiply. Weeks passed, and her absence after hours grew from once a month to twice a week, then 3 times. She brushed it off as a temporary surge of work that would ease soon enough. Just bear with me, okay? This campaign is a big one, she'd say, kissing me on the cheek before slipping out the door with her briefcase. As usual, I'd tell her to take her time, that I had the kids covered, that we'd keep dinner warm for her. But my reassurances started to feel like empty words, words that didn't align with a nagging feeling forming in the back of my mind. I tried to silence those whispers of doubt. After all, wasn't it my role to trust my wife, to support her in her work? In the rare moments she was home, she still smiled at me, still joked around. It wasn't as though our connection had vanished completely, and we managed to keep things smooth, especially around the kids. Yet, there was a distance in her eyes, something I hadn't seen before. I caught her lost in thought more often, and when I asked if something was wrong, she'd brush it off with a tired smile. I told myself that this was just a phase. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the feeling grew, a gnawing suspicion that something was wrong. One Friday, we had planned a family night. The kids were eager, we'd promised them pizza, movies, and popcorn in the living room. But just as I was finishing up the snacks, Sarah came in, looking rushed, and told me she'd have to head into the office unexpectedly. She promised she'd be back before the kids went to bed. Watching her leave, I couldn't shake the disappointment and a bitter edge of doubt. I kept thinking of how she'd used to light up at the thought of these nights, and I missed that version of her. But maybe that version was long gone. The turning point came the next morning. Sarah had left her phone on the kitchen counter while getting ready for her supposed morning meeting. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about her phone lying around. Privacy had always been sacred in our relationship, something we both respected. But this time, my curiosity got the best of me. I don't know if it was the frequency of her absences or that strange distance that was growing between us, but I reached for her phone. I told myself it was just to check the time, but my fingers betrayed me, scrolling through her messages almost on their own. And there it was, an open conversation with someone saved under the name Jake. I tapped it, feeling my heart hammering against my chest as the messages unfolded. My eyes traced each line, disbelief mingling with a sickening wave of realization. Jake, last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. Sarah, me too. I needed that. When can we do it again? I felt my stomach twist painfully. In that moment, my world began to unravel. My first instinct was to march upstairs, confront her, demand an explanation. But a second, quieter thought held me back. If I confronted her now, she'd deny it, rationalize it, twist it into something that was just a mistake or harmless. No, I needed to understand the full picture before taking action. I needed to know if this was a fling or if it was something deeper, something that had driven a wedge between us all this time. For the next few days, I played the part of the unsuspecting husband. I kept up the routines, made breakfast, kissed her goodbye before she left for work. But inside, I was watching, gathering every small detail, every clue she unwittingly left behind. I began tracking her movements with a quiet desperation, looking for patterns in her lies. I checked our phone bills, scanned through credit card transactions, anything that might provide further proof. It was in the bank statements that I found my next piece of evidence. She had withdrawn several $100s the previous month at a restaurant in a neighboring city, a place she'd never mentioned visiting. I felt a mixture of anger and validation, as though my suspicion had been justified. The weight of betrayal became heavier, almost suffocating. This was no simple affair. She had built a second life behind my back, one filled with clandestine meetings, hidden expenses, and moments she had sworn to keep secret. Each time I looked at her now, it was as though I was seeing a stranger, someone who had carefully constructed a facade to fool me. Every smile, every kiss, every gesture seemed hollow, twisted by the lies she'd woven around us. The thought of our kids crept into my mind, adding another layer of anger and hurt. How could she do this to them? To us? I kept my discovery to myself, carrying on with the charade of a happy husband, but beneath the surface, I was unraveling. My mind spun with 1,000 questions. I wanted to confront her right then, demand an explanation, maybe even scream, but I held back. I needed to be certain of everything, to understand just how deeply this betrayal ran. That weekend, I took the kids to my parents' house for a day, leaving Sarah behind at home. She claimed she had to catch up on work. While the kids were busy playing with their grandparents, I used the time to scour our phone bill and credit card statements further, trying to piece together her pattern. One restaurant, one night at a hotel, one afternoon she'd supposedly been working late. The evidence stacked up, each piece hammering the truth home with brutal clarity. There were too many meetings, too many missing hours she'd failed to mention. By the time I returned home that evening, I felt a dull ache in my chest. Everything had changed. Sarah greeted us with her usual smile, her mask firmly in place, and I had to swallow the bile rising in my throat. I could barely look at her without feeling the sting of her betrayal, yet I had to keep pretending. Late that night, when the house was silent and the kids were asleep, I lay awake, my thoughts whirling in the darkness. What was I supposed to do now? I had always believed in loyalty, in commitment, in working through issues. I thought we could weather any storm. But this wasn't some small misunderstanding or a rough patch. She had shattered the trust that held our family together. The woman I thought I knew, the one I had shared my life with, was no longer the same person. The Sarah I had loved seemed like an illusion now, a stranger hidden behind lies. A few days later, I came home early, intentionally taking her by surprise. I wanted to see her reaction, to catch any hint of guilt or nervousness. When I walked through the door, she was in the kitchen, talking on the phone. As soon as she saw me, her eyes widened, and she quickly ended the call, her face flushed. "Hey, you're home early," she said, her voice a little too bright. She turned back to chopping vegetables, her movements hurried. "Yeah, work wrapped up early," I replied casually, leaning against the counter, watching her closely. "Who were you talking to?" She froze for a moment before quickly composing herself. "Oh, just a friend from work," she replied, not meeting my eyes. Her hands were shaking slightly as she resumed chopping. It was a small tell, one that might have gone unnoticed before, but now I picked up on every detail. I didn't press her further. Instead, I let the silence stretch, and I could see her discomfort grow. Eventually, she mumbled something about needing to finish dinner and busied herself in the kitchen. I stayed close, watching her every move, waiting for any slip. But she was careful, controlled. Years together had taught her how to read my moods, and she must have sensed something was off. The next few days passed in a tense blur. I began to grow obsessed with catching her in the act, getting undeniable proof, something that couldn't be explained away. I wasn't sure if it was anger, sadness, or some twisted need for closure driving me, but I couldn't stop. So, one night, I slipped a small tracking app onto her phone, something she'd never notice in the background. The app would record her movements, her calls, her texts, anything that would give me insight into her secret life. I knew it was invasive, but I didn't care anymore. She had broken our trust first. The information started pouring in almost immediately. It wasn't just the same old story of late nights at work. I saw her trips to places she'd never mentioned, conversations that hinted at more than just casual friendship. Each message, each meeting confirmed what I had feared: she was not only seeing this man behind my back but was deeply invested in it. The texts were playful, intimate, words she hadn't shared with me in years. I read messages where she gushed over the nights they'd spent together, the moments they had to sneak away from her real life, as she called it. That phrase hit me like a punch to the gut. The betrayal was complete, undeniable, and all-encompassing. She had chosen him over the life we had built. It was as if she was living two lives, the one with me and our kids and the other with him, a life I was shut out from entirely. When I had gathered enough evidence to confront her, I made up my mind that this wouldn't be some ugly shouting match or tearful scene. I would take back control, the power she had stolen from me with her lies. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of an emotional outburst. Instead, I started planning my own quiet revenge, something that would leave her just as blindsided and broken as she had left me. I began with our finances. Over the next few weeks, I quietly reallocated funds, shifting money into accounts solely under my name, accounts she wouldn't have access to once everything came to light. I began documenting every suspicious charge, every night she came home late without explanation. With each step, I felt a strange sense of calm. Planning this, working toward my own retribution, gave me a clarity and focus I hadn't felt in weeks. I made sure to keep my facade intact, though. Sarah couldn't know that I was onto her, that I was setting her up for the inevitable fall. So, I continued with our routine as though nothing had changed, as though I was still the unsuspecting husband she had made a fool of. I kissed her goodnight, I laughed at her jokes, I even let her think she had me completely fooled. Then, I began laying the groundwork for the final piece of my plan. I started talking to a lawyer, learning about my options, about what evidence I would need to make sure our divorce went in my favor. My lawyer advised patience, saying that the more proof I had, the stronger my case would be. So, I waited, gathering text messages, receipts, and a record of every suspicious transaction. I was building an airtight case that would leave no room for doubt. Meanwhile, I kept up appearances at home. Each time she looked at me with that same smile, that same facade, I felt a mix of rage and satisfaction. She had no idea what was coming. All those little lies, the excuses, the late nights, and work trips, they would all come crashing down soon enough. One night, Sarah mentioned she'd be going out with friends again, her expression nonchalant as though she had done nothing wrong. I watched her closely, noticing the small details, the excitement in her eyes, the way she seemed to be somewhere else entirely. She kissed me goodbye, and as she left, I felt a cold, steely resolve settle over me. Soon, I would reveal everything. Soon, she would face the full weight of her choices. But not yet. Not until I was ready. As the days passed, the final stage of my plan took shape. I'd laid the groundwork, collected the evidence, and prepared for every possible twist. My focus now was on timing, on waiting for the perfect moment when my actions would deliver the greatest impact. The coming weekend would be the catalyst. Sarah believed she'd be spending it out with friends, as she called it, but I knew she had plans to meet Jake. She had no idea I knew every detail, or that I'd used her lie as the very tool to bring everything crashing down. On Friday evening, I prepared a small, carefully worded letter. In it, I outlined the pain her betrayal had caused, the emptiness of her deception, and how our lives together, every memory we'd shared, now felt tainted. I didn't go into graphic details. I wanted her to know that her actions hadn't just hurt me, they'd obliterated every ounce of trust and respect I'd had for her. This wasn't a plea or an attempt to win her back. It was simply my statement of the truth, a truth she would have to face alone. I waited until she was in the shower to slip the letter into her suitcase, tucked carefully among her clothes. I wanted her to read it far away, to understand the depth of her actions when she wasn't under the same roof as me and the kids. The following morning, Sarah was rushing around, clearly excited for her weekend, oblivious to the fate waiting for her. She kissed the kids, gave me a casual wave, and left, carrying that suitcase and the letter she had no idea was hidden inside. With Sarah gone, I gathered the kids and took them to my parents' house, explaining that we were going to stay there for the weekend. It was a simple cover, just in case Sarah decided to call or check in. Once the kids were settled in and playing with their grandparents, I returned home to put the final pieces in motion. As I walked through the empty house, each room seemed heavier, charged with memories and moments that now felt empty and hollow. My lawyer had advised me to notify Sarah in person, to ensure she couldn't contest any sudden actions in court later on. That's where the last part of my plan came in. I took a deep breath and texted her, telling her I'd come by on Sunday afternoon to pick her up. I knew she wouldn't argue, she'd think I was simply offering her a ride home, maybe even that I'd missed her. But I didn't plan on having a conversation. I was only there to make sure she knew there was no coming back. The rest of the weekend was a blur of quiet anticipation and carefully timed moves. I spent the next day consolidating the accounts, securing my position with the house, and filing the final divorce papers. By the time I was done, I had taken everything we'd shared and locked it away from her reach. I had made sure there was no loophole, no way she could twist or reclaim anything that had been built on my effort and sacrifice. Sunday arrived, and I drove out to the address I'd seen in her messages to Jake. It was a small bed and breakfast about an hour from the city, the perfect hideaway for someone living a double life. As I parked outside, my heart pounded with a mix of anger and satisfaction. I wasn't here to cause a scene. I was here to deliver a final, silent message that this was the end. I walked into the lobby and asked the front desk if they could send a message to her room, saying her husband was waiting. As I sat in the lobby, I thought about the life I was leaving behind. I knew the confrontation was inevitable, but a strange calm had settled over me. I was done being manipulated, done with the lies and the pretenses. When Sarah finally came down, her face turned pale as she saw me. For a moment, she just stood there, her mouth slightly open, as if trying to find words. "Mark, what are you doing here?" she stammered, trying to regain her composure. "I thought it was time to come clean, Sarah," I said, my voice steady. "About everything." Her eyes darted around the lobby, as though looking for an escape route, but I didn't move. I wanted her to face this without any option to run. "What are you talking about?" she tried to say, feigning innocence, but the nervous edge in her voice betrayed her. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I replied, holding her gaze. "I know about Jake. I know about all of it. I know what's been happening right under my nose for months." Her face fell, her facade cracking as she realized there was no way to spin this. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "Don't. Just stop," I said firmly. "I don't want an explanation. I don't want excuses. I just wanted you to know that it's over. I've filed for divorce. I'm taking full custody of the kids, and you'll be hearing from my lawyer soon." For the first time, the full weight of my words seemed to hit her. She looked at me, her eyes filled with shock and something that might have been regret. But I didn't feel any sympathy. This was her mess, her choice. She had dismantled our life, and now she had to live with the consequences. "Mark, please, let's talk about this," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. I shook my head, feeling a strange sense of closure wash over me. "There's nothing left to talk about, Sarah. You made your choice. You chose him over us. You left me no other option. She stood there, speechless, her face pale as she tried to process everything. But I was done waiting, done letting her waste any more of my time. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving her in the lobby, clutching the life she had destroyed with her own hands. Driving back home, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. It hurt to end things this way, to know that the woman I'd loved was gone, replaced by someone I could barely recognize. But at the same time, I felt free. I had taken control back, reclaimed my dignity, and secured a new beginning for me and the kids. I knew there would be difficult days ahead, but this was a step forward, a chance to rebuild a life grounded in truth and trust. When I returned to my parents' house to pick up the kids, they sensed something had changed. I knelt down, hugging them tightly, realizing that they were the reason I had found the strength to go through with everything. They deserved a stable, loving home, a life without secrets and lies. And I promised myself that I would give them that, no matter what. That night, as I lay in bed alone for the first time in years, I felt the finality of it all sink in. My marriage was over, the trust shattered beyond repair. But in its place, I had found something new, a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to rebuild my life on my own terms. And though I didn't know what the future held, I knew one thing for certain: I would never allow myself to be deceived like this again. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I closed my eyes and fell into a peaceful, dreamless sleep. The days following that confrontation were filled with a quiet relief that settled over me, but there was an emptiness too. Sarah had tried calling several times, sending messages that ranged from apologies to pleas, each one more desperate than the last. But I didn't respond. I'd had my say, and I intended to keep it that way. The divorce moved quickly, and despite a few initial protests, Sarah signed the papers, aware that any fight would only prolong her shame. I had expected anger or bitterness, but instead, her response surprised me. She remained uncharacteristically silent and detached, as if finally resigned to the weight of her own actions. My lawyer remarked that I was fortunate she hadn't pushed for more, that things had gone as smoothly as they had, given the circumstances. Weeks turned to months, and Sarah's presence faded from my daily life. She moved out of the house, and I continued with the routines I built with the kids. We adjusted, found a new rhythm, and even began to smile more, finding peace in the quiet, familiar comforts of home. I'd like to say I never thought of her, but that wasn't true. Late at night, in those vulnerable moments just before sleep, memories would creep in, reminders of the life we'd once shared. I pushed them away, holding on to the knowledge that I had done what was right, that I had finally reclaimed my life. It was around this time that I received a call I wasn't expecting. I was picking the kids up from school, scrolling through emails on my phone, when her name appeared on the screen. I ignored it, focusing instead on the kids as they climbed into the car, chattering about their day. But the call lingered in my mind, and when I finally had a quiet moment that evening, I listened to her voicemail. Her voice was soft, almost hollow, as she spoke. "Mark, it's me. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I know you don't owe me anything. I know that. But if you could find it in yourself to talk to me, I'd be grateful." There was a pause, a long, broken silence, and then she added, "I just need to talk to you. Please." For days, I didn't respond. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear her out, wasn't sure I owed her any more time than I'd already given. But there was something in her voice, a rawness, a vulnerability, that struck me. Against my better judgment, I texted her back, agreeing to meet. When I saw her, she was barely recognizable. Gone was the confident, vibrant woman I'd once known. In her place was someone visibly broken, weighed down by guilt and grief. Her once bright eyes were rimmed red, and she looked thinner, frail in a way I hadn't expected. She met me with a tentative smile, but it was weak, haunted. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything," she began, her voice trembling. "But I need to tell you what's been going on." I sat across from her, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. Sarah, what's left to say? You made your choices. We've moved on. She nodded, swallowing hard. I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But, you deserve to know what happened. Why things fell apart. She paused, gathering her thoughts, and then continued in a whisper. It wasn't just Jake. It was never just about him. I was diagnosed with cancer, Mark. Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I felt my breath catch as her revelation settled over me. When? I managed to ask, my voice barely audible. About a year ago, she said, eyes filling with tears. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought, if you knew, you'd treat me differently. You'd see me as weak, as someone you had to care for, someone who was slipping away. She shook her head, choking back a sob. I didn't want that. So I pushed you away. I thought maybe if I created distance, I could spare you from watching me suffer. But I was selfish, Mark. I made choices out of fear, choices I'm not proud of. I let someone else in because, I didn't want you to feel burdened by me. I felt as though the ground had shifted beneath me, every certainty I'd held on to crumbling in an instant. The anger, the betrayal, everything I'd felt for months, seemed suddenly small, almost trivial in the face of her confession. What kind of cancer? I finally asked, my voice thick with disbelief. She took a shaky breath. Lung cancer. It was aggressive, and by the time they found it, it had already spread. I've been through treatment, but it's not enough. I sat there, numb, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a lead blanket. All of it, the distance, the lies, even her betrayal, had been her way of coping, of distancing herself from a future she couldn't face. The realization filled me with a crushing sadness, a loss that extended beyond anything I'd prepared myself for. She reached across the table, her hand trembling. I don't expect you to forgive me. I didn't want to leave this world without you knowing the truth. I looked at her, my mind racing through memories, moments we had shared, the life we had built that now felt irrevocably changed. Part of me wanted to turn away, to walk out and leave her with her choices, her secrets. But another part, the part that had once loved her, the part that remembered our vows, for better or worse, couldn't ignore the woman sitting before me, fragile and defeated. Why didn't you just tell me? I whispered, my voice breaking. Why did you go through this alone? I was scared, Mark, she said, tears slipping down her cheeks. I thought I was sparing you. I see now that I was wrong, that I hurt you more than I ever meant to. But I didn't want my illness to define our marriage, to change how you saw me. We sat there in silence, the weight of her words settling over us. I thought of the future I had envisioned without her, the plans I had made, the life I thought I would rebuild alone. But now, in this moment, I felt lost, torn between the betrayal of the past and the undeniable truth of the present. Eventually, I found the words I had been searching for. What do you need from me, Sarah? She looked up, surprise flickering across her face. Nothing. I don't want anything from you, Mark. I just wanted you to know the truth. That's all. But as I watched her, her vulnerability exposed, I realized that part of me couldn't walk away. The woman I had married was still there, hidden beneath the pain and the mistakes, the woman I had once loved with all my heart. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my decision. I don't know what this means for us, I said softly. But you don't have to face this alone. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she reached out to take my hand. We sat there, no words left to say, the silence filled with an understanding that transcended everything we had been through. I knew our future was uncertain, that I might never fully forgive her, but I couldn't leave her to face the end alone. In the days that followed, I spent more time with her, helping with doctor's appointments, offering whatever comfort I could. The resentment lingered, a scar that would never fully heal, but in its place grew a bittersweet connection. We spent quiet moments together, laughing at old memories, sharing stories with the kids, savoring every moment we had left. When she passed, it was a quiet morning, sunlight filtering through the window as I sat beside her, holding her hand. She left this world with a soft smile, a final peace settling over her face. And though I was left with an ache that would never fade, I knew that I had done what was right. In the end, I wasn't left with revenge or anger, but with a profound sadness, a love that had been fractured, a life I had once known slipping away. And as I moved forward, the memories of what we'd shared, flawed and painful as they were, became a part of me, a reminder of the fragility of love, of life, and of the choices that define us.